"Don't drink that, sir," the little black girl hissed, her small hand gripping the recorder so tightly the silver casing gleamed under the chandelier's morning light. Robert Whitaker froze mid-fork lift, eyes widening as the polished red rec light blinked insistently. The nanny's composed smile faltered, a faint tremor in her fingers as she reached for the sugar bowl. I don't know what you mean," she said quickly, voice clipped and overly polite, trying to maintain control. "It's in the cup," the girl said, stepping closer, eyes sharp, voice steady, though no one had taught her how to confront a mansion full of adults. Silence engulfed the breakfast room. The porcelain clink of untouched spoons filled the space like a heartbeat. Robert's lips parted, unsure whether to trust the girl or assume some mistake, but his gaze lingered on the suspiciously frothy surface of the milk, on the shadowy reflection of the nanny behind the polished oak table. 3 hours earlier, sunlight had streamed through the tall windows of the Whitaker mansion, dust motes drifting lazily in the air, and the smell of roasted coffee beans mingled with the faint, metallic scent of silver polish. On the counter, a folded receipt from the hospital sat slightly askew, a lone fingerprint smudged along the edge. The recorder had been resting atop it, waiting. Annie had noticed how the nanny had moved too quickly toward the cup, brushing her sleeve against the glass just a second too long. A subtle shift Robert did not yet see. The silver recorder vibrated faintly in Annie's grip, red light a small, relentless pulse. She did not speak again, only lifted her chin, letting her stare at the cup and then at the nanny, as if the whole room had become a question. Robert's heart ticked unevenly in his chest. He felt the pull of disbelief, the tight knot of doubt, and the first icy thread of fear weaving through him. The nanny straightened, smiled again, too fast, too perfect, and adjusted her necklace as though to hide the tension creeping through her posture. Annie's eyes flicked momentarily to the timestamp glowing on the recorder's tiny screen. It had recorded every whisper, every calculated move, and yet she had not yet pressed play. The faint clatter of a spoon against a bowl behind them, the soft hum of the refrigerator, even the distant turn of a security camera lens caught in the corner of the room, all seemed magnified as though amplifying the stakes of the moment. She whispered, almost inaudibly, "It's going to happen if he drinks." And the words hung in the space between them, sharp enough to cut through the polished morning calm. Robert took a hesitant step back, brow furrowing, but the nanny's gaze darted to the side, lips pressing together as if to suppress a laugh that was not amused. Something on the silver tray beside the cup, an odd streak of adhesive where a label had been peeled off, made Robert pause, his fork halfway to the plate. Annie's small hand tensed on the recorder, her thumb brushing the red light, ready to reveal more. The moment stretched, breath held, tension building in a room that was still just a sunlit breakfast, yet trembling with the weight of a secret no one else had noticed. But one glance at the recorder told Robert that this day would not end as any of them expected. Robert Whitaker's hand hovered over the recorder, thumb poised just above the play button. Yet his eyes were drawn instead to the fine streak of perfume on the nanny's coat sleeve, a subtle aroma he had not noticed before that morning. The sunlight slanted through the high windows, catching dust in a golden haze, and for a moment the room seemed suspended in time, the tick of the grandfather clock blending with the faint whir of the ice maker in the kitchen. Annie, small and deliberate, shifted the recorder slightly so the red light faced him, her fingers brushing the edge of a folded hospital receipt left carelessly on the sideboard. She whispered, almost to herself, "She said 7:15, but it's 7:05. And Robert's gaze followed hers to the clock, a discrepancy of 10 minutes that no one else would notice. The nanny's smile remained serene, hand lightly resting on the back of her chair, but her eyes flicked to the tray with a microsecond hesitation, the kind of almost imperceptible motion that set a parent's instincts on edge. Robert stepped closer to the counter, noticing the coffee receipt for 2 cups, even though only he had been served, and a small, folded note tucked under the sugar bowl with a name repeated twice in neat cursive. Annie leaned forward, catching a flash of a deleted voicemail notification on the old phone sitting beside the tray, screen dark but revealing its absence. She fingered the recorder as if connecting the invisible dots, eyes sharp, voice tiny but commanding. He wouldn't hear this if she got her way. The nanny adjusted the napkin again, slower this time, as though counting seconds while maintaining poise, and Robert's hand traced the edge of the dining table, noting an imperfection in the wood that aligned exactly with the timestamp on the recorder. Subtle, almost nothing, but enough to tug at the frayed edges of suspicion. Outside, rain tapped a steady rhythm against the window, the sound almost comforting until a flash of light from the polished doorknob reflected something odd. A shadow moving counter to the sun, and Annie caught it immediately, whispering, "The shadow's wrong?" Eyes scanning the corner where the hallway camera had blinked off for 3 seconds just moments ago. Robert exhaled, slow, quiet, internalizing each detail. The streak of perfume, the receipt, the shadow, the missing footage. And he did not yet move to accuse or intervene, only studied, memorized, and recorded in his mind the subtle betrayals threaded through the ordinary breakfast. The little girl's lips pressed together, thumb gently holding the recorder steady, and as she let out a single, deliberate blink toward the nanny's eyes darted for just the barest instant to the stairwell. That split-second glance, the hesitation in a gesture meant to seem natural, made Robert's chest tighten, the first true pulse of alarm and Annie's whisper, "It's not a mistake," hung frozen in the warm sunlight, a chilling prelude that what had seemed like intuition was now unmistakably something deliberate. Robert Whitaker's eyes flicked toward the corner of the room where the nanny had crouched momentarily, a hand brushing against the edge of the polished buffet. Annie shifted the recorder slightly, the red light reflecting off the crystal glasses, and whispered, "She said she'd mix it at 7:20. Robert glanced at the ornate wall clock. It read 7:16. The nanny's lips tightened into a controlled smile, but a faint hitch in her breath betrayed her calm as she reached under the counter, fingers brushing over a folded slip of paper that had been partially hidden beneath a stack of white linen napkins. Annie's gaze followed the motion, noting the receipt from the hospital tucked under the sugar jar, the timestamp inked in pen, 7:18. Misaligned with the schedule the nanny had verbally confirmed. She did not move her lips, but her small hand lifted the recorder higher so the red light faced Robert, subtle and insistent. The nanny's eyes flicked toward the door and then away, as if calculating what to say next, her voice rising in an overly careful tone. I think you've misheard, sir." Robert's jaw clenched minutely, a slow exhale betraying his tension. He crouched slightly to see the subtle smear of adhesive on the receipt corner, a fingerprint faintly smudged, not matching his own, not matching any child's, but matching the curve of the nanny's ring. Outside the rain tapped lightly against the French doors, a background rhythm that made the room feel suspended, yet every drop seemed louder, sharper. Annie's dark eyes traced every small movement, the way the nanny adjusted her pearl bracelet, the almost imperceptible tremor in the folds of her blouse, and she held the recorder closer, thumb brushing over the tiny play button without pressing it. Robert's fingers hovered over the edge of the wooden table, lingering near the faint scratch left by a key card dropped and hastily picked up earlier, a minor imperfection that suddenly seemed monumental. The nanny straightened, her voice calm yet brittle. "Everything is in order for breakfast, sir. Perhaps you'd like some coffee." Her smile remained practiced, but her eyes flicked toward the recorder, toward Annie's unwavering stare, and back again. Annie's lips parted just enough to murmur, "The shadow in the hallway was wrong," referring to the momentary gap in security footage she had glimpsed on the old monitor by the foyer. Gap of 37 seconds where nobody could account for the nanny's whereabouts. Robert froze, hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, eyes narrowing, noting the slight hesitation in the nanny's steps as she repositioned herself to mask the monitor. The room smelled faintly of polished wood, cream, and the subtle hint of her perfume. Too strong, out of place, yet elegant, masking the tension beneath. Annie pressed the recorder closer to her chest and whispered, "It's not just the cup," letting the words hang between them. Robert's chest tightened as he followed her gaze toward the sugar bowl, then the small, misfiled hospital receipt, then back to the nanny, who for a heartbeat allowed a glance to slip, fingers hovering over a pen she had laid down moments before. That slight movement, that microsecond of misalignment, confirmed to Robert in a quiet, icy way that the first clue, the shifted timestamp, the misfiled paper, the glimmer of the red light, was deliberate, not accidental. The nanny took one step back from the breakfast table, her posture shifting from polished composure into something carefully rehearsed. As two security guards entered through the side corridor, their shoes silent on the marble floor. "Sir," one of them said politely to Robert Whitaker, "we've been asked to ensure there's no misunderstanding here." Behind them, a woman in a tailored blazer, his legal advisor, followed closely, eyes already scanning Annie like a problem to be categorized rather than a child to be heard. Annie did not move. She only tightened her grip on the silver recorder, the red light still blinking like a steady heartbeat in her small hand. The nanny immediately softened her expression, turning slightly toward the lawyer. "This child has been confused," she said gently, voice measured and sympathetic, as if correcting an innocent mistake. "She must have seen something on television or misunderstood a private conversation." The lawyer nodded faintly, already reaching for a clipboard, while one of the guards shifted closer to Annie, not threatening but creating space that felt smaller with every breath she took. Robert raised a hand slightly, signaling pause, but even his authority seemed diluted in the structure of procedure forming around them. "Let's not escalate this," the lawyer said calmly, glancing at the recorder without acknowledging it fully. "We should protect the child from false conclusions." Annie's eyes stayed steady, unflickering, as she whispered, "I didn't hear it on TV." Her voice was small but precise, like a line drawn in ink. The nanny let out a soft, almost disappointed breath, as if saddened by imagination rather than accusation, and adjusted her bracelet again with controlled elegance. The room around them, the chandelier light, the polished silverware, the distant hum of the mansion's climate system, began to feel like it was pressing inward, narrowing the space where truth could exist. Robert watched the nanny carefully, noticing how she subtly angled her body to block the hallway camera's line of sight, just as the guard leaned in slightly and said, "We can review any concerns through proper channels, sir. Right now, it seems we have a misunderstanding involving a child's device." Annie's fingers did not loosen. Instead, she lifted the recorder just enough for Robert to see the red light reflect in his own eyes. The nanny gave a small, reassuring smile toward him, but it came a fraction too late, as if it had been rehearsed for a different outcome. "She's a guest," the lawyer added softly. "We should be careful about what impression this creates." Annie finally spoke again, quietly but with weight that did not match her size. "Then play it." The room fell still in a way that was not planned. Robert's gaze shifted between the recorder and the nanny, then to the lawyer who had already begun to reach toward Annie as if to gently lower her hand. And in that exact moment, the nanny adjusted her stance again, just slightly too fast, brushing the edge of the table, and unknowingly nudging the hospital receipt on the sideboard just enough that its time-stamped corner slid fully into plain view for Robert to see. Robert Whitaker did not move when the edge of the hospital receipt slid fully into view. It lay there on the polished sideboard like something accidentally confessed, its ink timestamp sharp, enough to cut through the morning light. 7:18 a.m. His eyes stayed locked on it longer than anyone in the room expected. The lawyer cleared her throat softly, already reaching to adjust the paper away, but Robert raised two fingers. Not a command, not yet, just a pause that froze even the guards mid-breath. Annie stepped forward before anyone could touch it, her small hand pressing the recorder closer to her chest as if it could be taken at any second. "Don't move it," she said quietly, not to the adults, but to the object itself, like it mattered more than the people surrounding it. The nanny exhaled a soft, almost amused sound, but it didn't reach her eyes this time. Robert leaned in, reading again, slower, noticing the name printed beneath the hospital logo, Whitaker Pediatric Consultation Unit. Yet the appointment time overlapped exactly with the moment she had claimed to be in the kitchen preparing breakfast. A silence stretched so thin it felt like glass. From somewhere deeper in the house, a distant television clicked on. Morning news, volume too low to identify, but it only made the stillness in the room sharper. Annie tilted her head slightly. "She wasn't there," she said, pointing not at the nanny, but at the time itself. The nanny's smile tightened, and she stepped forward with controlled grace. "Children misunderstand schedules," she said gently, as if correcting math. But Robert was no longer looking at her face. His gaze drifted instead to the bracelet partially hidden under the edge of the napkin tray. Pale blue plastic with a hospital seal. It was not hers. He knew that immediately. His breath slowed as he reached for it, lifting it carefully between two fingers. The printed name on it was smudged at the last letter, as if someone had tried to erase it in haste. Annie's voice lowered. "It was in her coat," she said, nodding toward the hallway where the nanny had come from. The nanny's hand moved instinctively toward her sleeve, then stopped halfway, freezing in the air before lowering again with deliberate calm. Robert turned the bracelet slightly toward the light. The date matched the receipt. The location matched the hospital system. But the patient name did not match anyone in this house. Not his son. Not the nanny. Not any staff listed in the registry he had memorized out of habit. It belonged to someone who was not supposed to be part of this morning. A faint sound of rain returned against the windows, steady now, like a rhythm trying to mask the tension inside the room. Robert's thumb brushed the edge of the bracelet as if confirming it was real, as if reality itself had shifted texture. Annie did not blink. She simply held the recorder higher, as though waiting for permission the adults were too afraid to give. The nanny let out a small laugh, too soft, too rehearsed. "That must be from a prior shift," she said quickly. But her eyes flicked toward the kitchen door before returning too late. Robert noticed it this time. That fraction of a second. That direction. That hesitation. And in that exact moment, he realized the hospital bracelet was not the mistake. It was the anchor to something that had already begun long before breakfast. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Why were you there at 7:18? The nanny didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Annie. And for the first time, Robert Whittaker saw something in her expression that did not belong in a caregiver standing inside his home. The nanny still stood perfectly still, but the air around her had changed. No longer defensive, now carefully measured, as if she were adjusting to a room that had stopped believing her. Robert Whittaker didn't raise his voice. He simply set the hospital bracelet back on the table beside the receipt, aligning them side by side like two sentences that no longer agreed with each other. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass doors, steady and indifferent, while somewhere in the kitchen a refrigerator hummed, loud in the silence. Annie didn't move either. She only watched Robert, not the adults around him, as if waiting for him to finally see the shape of what she had already seen. "Get me every entry from the East Wing cameras," Robert said quietly into his phone, stepping away from the table just enough that his back was no longer facing anyone. His legal advisor blinked, surprised at the tone, not angry, not emotional, just precise. "And cross-check hospital access logs for 7 to 7:30 this morning," he added, voice low enough that it felt like it belonged to the house itself rather than the room. The nanny gave a soft laugh, almost polite. "Sir, this is really unnecessary," she began, but Robert lifted a hand without looking at her, and she stopped mid-sentence. Annie shifted slightly closer to the table, careful not to touch anything now, her fingers tightening around the recorder until the red light reflected faintly in her wrist. "I just want her to stop lying," Annie said quietly, not accusing, not pleading, just stating it like a fact that had been waiting too long to be spoken. The room didn't respond. Only the rain did. A few seconds later, Robert's phone vibrated once. He looked at it, expression unchanged, but his eyes narrowed just slightly as he stepped closer to the window, turning his back on everyone without fully turning away. On the screen was a partial camera return file. 7:13 to 7:20 had been flagged as interrupted feed. 7 minutes missing. 7 minutes that should not have been missing in a secured mansion system. Behind him, the nanny adjusted her stance again. Too controlled now, her calm no longer natural but maintained. Annie noticed first. "That's when she left the kitchen," she said softly, almost to herself. The nanny turned immediately. "I never left the kitchen," she said, faster than before, too fast to sound rehearsed this time. Robert didn't answer. He simply enlarged the footage, watching the freeze frame of an empty hallway camera that should have shown movement but didn't. Then he saw it, A timestamp overlap, a secondary log entry rerouted through an internal admin key. A key assigned only to 3 people in the house. One of them had never been questioned before. The rain outside grew slightly heavier, tapping faster against the glass like a quiet warning. Robert slowly lowered his phone, eyes no longer on the screen, but on the reflection in the window behind him. And for the first time that morning, he understood not just that someone had lied, but that he had trusted the wrong person long enough for the lie to become routine. Robert Whitaker did not speak. He placed the hospital bracelet carefully back beside the receipt, then gestured subtly for Annie to keep the recorder aimed toward the center of the room. Rain continued its steady tap against the windows, a quiet rhythm beneath the tension. The nanny straightened, hands folded over her apron, eyes flicking once to the side where the East Wing camera glimmered with a blinking green light. "Sir, perhaps you would like to sit down while we clarify," she began, voice polished and calm, but Robert raised a single finger, halting her mid-sentence. Annie leaned slightly closer, whispering. She didn't go back to the kitchen, and the nanny's smile tightened imperceptibly as she adjusted the bracelet on her wrist. Robert's gaze shifted slowly around the room. The silver tray with untouched tea, the polished oak sideboard, the red light of the recorder steady in Annie's small hands. "Show me the coffee cup you prepared," he said quietly, his voice low, controlled. The nanny lifted the tray, but Robert's eyes lingered on the slight tilt of the cup, the way her thumb brushed the edge too deliberately, and the faint streak of perfume on her sleeve, subtle, measured, not accidental. Annie tapped the recorder lightly with her fingers, almost rhythmically, a small sound that drew attention without announcing itself. "What did you say to the phone this morning?" Robert asked next, calm and deliberate, eyes still tracing the streaked ink on the receipt. The nanny froze, hesitated, and then answered with a clipped, overly measured tone. "Only the usual confirmations, sir." Her lips tightened as she angled her body slightly, blocking a direct line to the camera in the corner. Annie's eyes caught the hesitation, the microsecond glance, the way her foot pivoted just offbeat. "It wasn't usual," she said quietly. Robert did not respond immediately, letting the silence stretch. The guards shifted uneasily, noticing the subtle control in his stance, the way his hand rested lightly on the sideboard without reaching for anything. A phone on the nearby counter vibrated briefly, screen lighting up with a partially deleted text, but no one dared touch it. "Set the recorder near the coffee cup," Robert said, voice even, almost casual, though every word held weight. Annie obeyed, placing it so that the red light pointed directly at the tray, angled to capture both the cup and the nanny's hands. The nanny moved, reaching to adjust the cup, and froze when she realized the recorder was in the perfect position. Robert's gaze did not waver. He was still calm, methodical, but in the quiet, Annie could see the shift, the first crack in the nanny's carefully constructed control. The chandelier light reflected on the recorder, a pinpoint of crimson red against the polished wood, and for the first time the nanny glanced fully at Annie, recognition dawning in her eyes. Annie's stance was small but unwavering. She was no longer alone. The tiny movement, the raised recorder, the unblinking gaze. All of it combined to show the nanny that whatever she had thought she controlled in this room had already slipped through her fingers. The recorder stopped blinking for a moment as Annie's thumb hovered above it. Then she pressed play without looking away from the nanny. The sound filled the breakfast room immediately, soft at first, then unmistakable. The nanny's voice, measured and precise, speaking into a phone that was never meant to be heard by anyone in this house. 7:18 is fine, the recording said. He'll already be at the table by then. Just make sure the timing matches the pharmacy log. The room did not move. Even the rain outside seemed to hesitate against the glass. Robert Whitaker stood completely still, his face unreadable, but the color had drained from it in a way that made the air feel colder. Annie did not speak. She only held the recorder steady, as if letting it carry all the weight she could not. The nanny's composure fractured in small, invisible ways, her fingers tightening at her sides, her shoulders lifting half an inch before forcing themselves back down. "That's edited," she said quickly, too quickly, stepping forward as if sound itself could be corrected by proximity. But Robert raised his hand again, not looking at her, only at the recorder as it continued. The audio shifted, another layer, another voice time-stamped from the same morning. A second recording, this time showing access logs being discussed, hospital entries being adjusted, names spoken with casual familiarity that did not belong in a kitchen. Delete the gap from 7:13 to 7:20, the voice said. The cameras will loop automatically if we overwrite the admin key. A silence followed that line so heavy it felt physical. Robert slowly turned his head toward the hallway camera. The small green indicator light was still blinking, but now it looked different, like something pretending it had always been watching. Annie stepped closer to Robert's side, her small voice cutting through the stillness. "That's when she left the kitchen," she said again, not as accusation, but as confirmation of something already proven. Robert did not answer. Instead, he reached for the hospital bracelet again, turning it slowly between his fingers. The ink timestamp, the misaligned schedule, the overlapping access logs, all of it began to align in his mind with a precision that made his jaw tighten. The nanny took one more step back, but there was nowhere in the room left to go that did not feel exposed. "You're making a mistake," she said, but the words lacked structure now, like a script losing its pages. Robert finally looked at her, not with anger, but with something far more final. The legal advisor behind him had already gone pale, her eyes moving between the recorder, the camera feed on her tablet, and the hospital receipt laid flat on the sideboard like a verdict that had been waiting to be read. Annie adjusted her grip on the recorder one last time and pressed pause, letting the silence take over again. It was worse than the recording. Robert exhaled slowly, almost inaudibly, as if every breath had become a calculation. He placed the hospital bracelet down beside the receipt, aligning them perfectly one last time. Then he looked at his legal advisor, voice low, steady, and completely changed from before. "Call my attorney." The mansion did not feel the same after Robert Whitaker said those 3 words. Not because anything had changed yet, but because everything had already been seen. The attorney arrived. Within 40 minutes, followed by a private forensic analyst, and the silence that filled the breakfast room was no longer confusion, it was procedure. Annie sat on the same chair she had not been invited to use, her feet not touching the floor, the recorder now resting safely in Robert's hand like something fragile and undeniable. The nanny stood near the edge of the room, no longer performing calm, only waiting. Robert placed all the items in a clean line on the table. The hospital receipt, the bracelet, the camera report, and the recorder. "We're going to do this properly," he said, voice steady but changed, as if he had moved from inside the house to above it. The attorney nodded once and began making calls without hesitation. Outside, the rain finally stopped, leaving the windows streaked with slow water trails that looked like the aftermath of something irreversible. Annie watched everything quietly, then pointed once at the bracelet. "That one belongs to someone who was scared," she said softly. No one corrected her. The nanny tried one last time to speak, but her voice no longer found structure. It dissolved halfway through her sentence. Within hours, the system inside the house began to shift. Security logs were locked, hospital records were pulled and verified, and the missing 7-minute gap in the footage was reconstructed through backup servers the nanny did not know existed. By evening, the truth no longer needed interpretation. The attorney spoke only once in full clarity. "This is intentional interference with medical and security oversight." The nanny was escorted out without resistance, not because she accepted it, but because there was nothing left to argue against. No spectacle followed her departure, only the quiet absence of someone who had once been trusted to stand too close to a child's glass of milk. Robert did not follow her. Instead, he stayed in the same room where everything had started, looking at the chair where Annie sat. For the first time that morning, he seemed to notice how small she actually was compared to everything she had interrupted. "You didn't just see it," he said quietly. Annie shook her head once. "I heard it. First," she replied. Later that night, the hospital records were corrected officially. The misfiled name was restored, the altered timestamps annotated, and the internal review initiated. The house staff received new oversight, Security protocols were rewritten. But none of that mattered in the moment Robert walked into the kitchen after midnight and saw Annie sitting at the table, wrapped in a clean blanket someone had quietly placed over her shoulders. A glass of milk sat in front of her, untouched for a second, then slowly lifted. Robert did not speak as she took a small sip, careful, like someone learning that something simple could finally be safe again. He placed a newly printed card beside her plate, a corrected identification tag with her name spelled properly. No notes, no omissions. Annie looked at it for a long time, then touched it with her fingertip as if confirming it was real. "It's right now," she said. Robert nodded once, then glanced toward the hallway where the morning had broken open. He did not say anything about money or systems or consequences. Instead, he pulled the chair opposite her and sat down, not as the owner of the house, but as someone who had finally learned where he had been looking the wrong direction. The kitchen light stayed on longer than usual that night, casting a warm stillness over the table, where nothing needed to be proven anymore, and the truth, quiet, undeniable, and finally heard, remained exactly where it should have been from the beginning.